Wednesday morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. We're happy you've joined us for today's session on planting the 2026 crop with an eye on investment returns. As we look outside our windows, the weather's changing here, and we've got a little bit of spring fever starting. So this is a timely session to wrap up our Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops series for the season. So these sessions are brought to you by University of Minnesota Extension and, of course, generous support from the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council and the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. I'm Matt Farr, University of Minnesota Extension educator based in Mankato, and I work with the Crops Extension team. And today we're welcoming two very special guests to Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops, Dr. Seth Nave, who is a University of Minnesota professor and the Extension soybean agronomist. Seth is based out of Hayes Hall on the St. Paul campus. We also are welcoming Dr. Jeff Coulter, who is the University of Minnesota professor and the Extension corn agronomist, and Jeff is also based out of Hayes Hall. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. We're glad to hear from you today. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started with our webinar and discussion. These sessions are a bit informal discussion type format after the presenters will lead us off with some discussion topics to prime the pump a bit. So we'll have about 30 minutes of information, and then we'll have a lot of discussion on the general topic. Again, today, planting for investment returns, and these questions will be there for you in the Q&A box. So that being said, if you have any questions, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen is where we'll direct those. You can enter those at any time during the session. If you're not familiar with Zoom, if you hover the mouse near the bottom of your screen, you will get that toolbar to appear with the Q&A box. You may need to exit full screen for that to happen. There is also a chat box feature in Zoom. If you have technical issues, let's use that option. Otherwise, we'll reserve that Q&A for the Q&A box only. All right. There's a very short 4-question survey when you leave today. If you could please take a minute to provide any feedback, we'd very much appreciate it. That helps us to continue to develop these programs the best we can for you. And then it also helps us with our federal reporting. And then each session will be recorded and it's going to be posted at a later date on our website. And also, I typically go to YouTube, the Extension Crops YouTube for that. You're going to see a lot of great long form videos like these webinars and also some short videos with timely crop production topics. Okay, so those are attending live today as a bonus. You're going to get CEUs. So if you need to pick that up at the end, just hang around. We'll show the QR code after the webinar wraps up today. Again, displayed right at the end of the program. So with that, very excited to turn this over to our first speaker today, Dr. Jeff Coulter. Welcome.
Hey, good morning. Great to be here today. So, as planting is kind of coming around the corner here, we thought it'd be important to talk a little bit about that. So, I'm going to go through a few things about planting, and before I do that, I'm going to touch a little bit on crop rotation because we still have the ability to manipulate what crops are going to be planted where to some degree. So, we all know that crop rotation increases yield, or that it should increase yield in most cases. There was kind of a pivotal study done a few years ago, and these researchers accessed USDA Risk Management Agency yield records, and they accessed 750,000 yield records from across the nation. They looked at different fields, what was planted there, what were the yields, and what was planted in the following years in those fields. And what they found was that basically there was a continuous corn yield penalty. It averaged about 4.3%, and the yield penalty was more severe in areas where there was low soil moisture and there was low yields. In addition, they found that the continuous corn yield penalty increased as the number of prior years in corn increased from 1 to 2, but it did not grow larger with additional years of corn. So kind of some of the key conclusions from that are kind of some obvious things. One is limit your continuous corn to your best fields. Another is to try to avoid growing corn for more than 2 years in a row in a given field. And if if a farmer has both corn grain and corn silage that they're raising, one option would be to consider growing silage corn as your first year corn after soybean, or first year corn, and then growing grain corn as the second year. Because when corn follows corn, and if that first year is silage corn, you got less residue from the silage, so then it would function more like corn following soybean. Another option for farmers who are looking to increase the amount of corn in their rotation is to look at a 3-year corn-soybean rotation. Some people have found that this can be kind of a sweet spot. There was some research done in Illinois that looked at this. They looked at the yields of corn and the yield of soybean. They looked at comparing a standard 2-year corn-soybean rotation to a 3-year corn-soybean rotation, and also to continuous corn. Yield was highest with the 2-year corn soybean rotation, but they also found that the first year corn yield in the 3-year rotation was the same. And that's what we would expect because corn is still following soybean in this place right here. And then when they looked at the second year of corn in that 3-year corn soybean rotation, they found that on average they were experiencing a 7% reduction in that yield for corn following corn. And in comparison to continuous corn grown 3 years in a row or more, they found that the yield was 10% lower than the 2-year corn soybean rotation. In addition, though, if they looked at the soybean yields, they found that they got about a 6% yield bump when they went from a 2-year corn soybean rotation to a 3-year corn soybean rotation. So adding that extra year of corn in there helps soybean, probably by breaking up pest cycles and those type of things. So let's move on to planting date. So, we're all hoping it's an early spring and we're excited to get out there and start doing some field work. What about planting? So we've done some planting date trials in Minnesota. One set of trials was done between 2009 and 2016. There were 26 trials across Minnesota, mainly in southern and central Minnesota. I think there were 3 trials from northwest Minnesota, and the results from those trials were basically similar as what we were finding in the other parts of the state. And this table here kind of summarizes the results. And generally, what we found was that I guess I'll show how I presented this here. In each of these trials, we had at least 4 planting dates. And I'm reporting the grain yield here as a percent of the maximum in a given trial. And then these results are combined over all the trials. And then also in this far right column, it shows the number of growing degree days accumulated since that first available planting date in the trials. And what we see here is that when we planted between April 12 and 17, grain yield was only 94 to 96% of the maximum. Planting between 18 to 24 of April, we had 97 to 98% of maximum yield. And then the sweet spot on average seemed to be that April 25 to May 12 window. And then once we got beyond that, the yield started to decline. And so it really looks like, we didn't start to lose significant yield until we got beyond about 140 growing degree days accumulated since that first available planting date. Oftentimes farmers and agronomists think that, the first planted corn is going to be the highest yielding. That's not always the case. That's not what we found in our trials, and that's also in agreement with what's been found in other parts of the Corn Belt, like Ohio. But, obviously it depends on what the year is. Sometimes spring comes early, and in that cases, then the optimum planting date inches a little earlier than normal. So there's a lot of things to think about with regards to planting date. We like to see that us having the tallest cornfield around and looking good. We think that's going to yield the most, and in some cases it does. But there's other things to consider. Oftentimes we get that nice warm up in early spring, and then we end up having a week to 10 days of cold weather, and that can really kind of not do any benefits for the crop. Another thing to think about is, there's a lot of factors that influence yield, and planting date is only one of them, and it generally has kind of a small effect. There's other things like obviously the weather or nitrogen. Those type of factors have a much bigger impact on yield. Another thing to think about is the germination. So the seeds need to imbibe 30% of their weight in water to germinate, and they also need to have a soil temperature of at least 50 degrees. So if we planted the corn seeds right now, they're going to start to imbibe water, they're going to swell, but they're not going to germinate because they're going to need to have 50-degree Fahrenheit soil temperature that's sustained. And once those seeds imbibe water, now they start to become susceptible to pathogens, that kind of thing. And the seed treatments are only effective so long. So I'm sure we've all seen corn sit in the ground for 4 weeks before it comes up. 3 weeks is not uncommon. And during that period, it's stressful for the crop as it's sitting there waiting to emerge. So there's a lot of things that we want to consider. And another one is that the number of working days that we have in the field has decreased over time. I think I saw a recent report that from Iowa or something that the number of working days in the field has decreased by like 5 days per month in the spring. So that really puts the pressure on farmers to be able to complete that field work in a timely manner. So obviously, we don't want to be wasting days when the sun is shining and the soil is dry, especially if the soil conditions are good for planting. But there are a few things we can think about with regards to planting. One of them is think about that expected weather and soil temperature during the 1 to 2 days after that projected planting date. If it looks like there's going to be a cold front coming through with cold temperatures, cold rain, and possibly snow flurries, that type of thing, it might be more prudent to kind of hold off and let that pass and then get your corn planted once it dries out and warms up a little bit again. And when we look at our planting date trials, generally it looks like the sweet spot is kind of no earlier than April 18th, but getting it all planted by May 12th. And then obviously, looking at soil conditions, that generally is like one of the most important factors. So we want to wait and make sure we have good soil conditions. We don't want to be planting into conditions that are too wet. If we do that, we're probably going to negate most or all of the advantages of getting an earlier planting date, particularly here in Minnesota, where we have a lot of fine textured soils that tend to smear and have sidewall compaction, compaction around the seed, that type of thing. Not a good situation. The other thing to think about is, as I showed earlier, generally for corn, we've seen little significant yield loss until over 140 growing degree days have accumulated since that first available planting date. And that's generally around that May 12 window, but it fluctuates based on the year and when that first available planting date is. So some of the keys for corn, corn is a little bit different than soybean. Um, and for corn, ideally, we want all those plants to emerge within about 2 days of each other. And that's because corn has limited ability to compensate from uneven or reduced stands. And that's unlike soybean, which has the ability to branch out. Um, if we think about what is the effect of some of those late emerging plants, if we have a plant that's one leaf stage behind early in the season, it's only going to yield 80% of normal. Now, the neighboring plants will be able to compensate a little bit, but not enough to make up for that 20% yield loss on that one plant. So um, it's really important to have as uniform emergence as we can in corn. And probably the biggest driver of uneven emergence is variations in soil moisture in the seed zone. We need to have uniform moisture where the seed is placed. We want to have good seed soil contact. If we're doing pre-plant tillage when it's too wet, we're going to have clods. And then we have clod to seed contact. And when we have clods in that surface zone, we've got air pockets, and that air pockets are not good. We want to have the seed surrounded completely by soil. We want to have it firmed in there so that the moisture can imbibe quickly from the soil into the seed. If we got air pockets in there, that's going to disrupt that, and that's going to lead to unevenness in soil moisture where the seed is, unevenness and imbibition of water by the seed, and non-uniform stands. And then obviously things like temperature and then soil crusting or soil compaction are also going to be problematic for uniform emergence. That uneven moisture in the seed zone is a big deal, and we want to make sure that our soil and residue conditions are, and where we're placing the seed is going to be promoting having that seed in uniform soil moisture. And in Minnesota, generally a 2-inch planting depth is going to be adequate to achieve uniform soil moisture in the seed zone, but it also needs a proper management with it. We don't want to have clods, that kind of thing in the seed zone. But another thing to think about is, what happens if it's very dry conditions. So if it ends up being very dry at the time of planting and the weather forecast is looking like it's going to continue to be dry, and the planting date is not excessively early, then one may want to consider going to 2.5 inches as a planting depth just to get more uniform soil moisture. There's been some research out of Ohio that's shown that a 2.5 inch planting depth works just fine, and in some cases results in more uniform emergence. So consider the 2.5 inch depth if planting under very dry conditions. Another thing, as I mentioned, for corn, one of the things that's unique about it is that the nodal roots, which are the primary root system on the plant, from about they start around V3 and they're important through maturity. They are located about 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface, and that's where they emerge from. So if we have sidewall compaction or any type of restriction in that near surface area, that's going to be problematic for those roots unless there's consistent moisture allowing moist soil for those roots to penetrate through. The roots that emerge off of the seed, they're called seminal roots. Those are really only important up to about the V3 stage. So we really need to try to avoid planting in wet soils and creating smearing and sidewall compaction because that's going to potentially inhibit the nodal root development. And the nodal roots are key for everything: water uptake, nutrient uptake, stability, those type of things. Other things to think about are hybrid selection. We still have the ability, maybe, to kind of manipulate the hybrids that we're choosing for which fields, that type of thing based on seed availability. Um, Obviously, we like to stay with what we've already chosen, but there are some options to move things around if needed. Generally, what we've been seeing in Minnesota and other parts of the Corn Belt is that the later maturity hybrids generally have higher yield potential than the mid-maturity hybrids on average. It's been about a 1% yield increase per each 1 unit relative maturity increase. And that's kind of talking on average. So what that would mean is if we're going, say, from a 103 maturity hybrid to a 105 maturity hybrid, on average across all the hybrids on the market, we're probably looking at a 2% yield bump for that. That's pretty substantial, but it does come with higher harvest moisture. So we need to kind of balance that. But even with the higher harvest moistures, if we have a good way to dry it down, generally that the greater yield pays for itself. But we also want to be cautious and not plant stuff that's too late in maturity for our area because we want it to obviously hit maturity before the first freeze in the fall. And then if we're in corn following corn, obviously we want to pay attention to things like suitability for corn on corn, emergence and seedling growth, and disease resistance. Another thing is, I'm sure many of you have heard this, but it's important to adopt new hybrids as they become available. But new hybrids do not always yield more because, oftentimes we see a hybrid on the market for 1 year and then it's pulled and something else is put in its place. But on average, the new hybrids yield more than the old hybrids. Over time, they've seen that there's been a genetic yield improvement of about 1.8 bushels per acre per year. So that means that the new hybrids available for 2026, on average, yield about 1.8 bushels per acre more than the hybrids that came out the year before. And the other thing to think about is hybrids are on the market for about 3 years. So, once we say that we have a particular hybrid in the 103 maturity range and we really like it and we plant it for 3 years, all of a sudden a new 103 maturity hybrid comes out and we switch to that one. On average, we can expect about a 5.4 bushel per acre yield increase from switching from the old hybrid to the new hybrid, just because it's been 3 years since we've switched hybrids, and the new hybrids increase at about 1.8 bushels per acre per year. So it's important to stay current with the hybrids, but also not plant all new hybrids because there is more variability in the yield of the new ones because they've undergone less testing. Another thing to think about is planting rate. Generally in Minnesota on highly productive soils, a planting rate of 34 to 36,000 seeds per acre maximizes yield or optimizes net return. But we do hear of situations where farmers are trying to push the population to get even higher yield. But we've done trials in the last 3 years, several trials, And we haven't seen any significant yield difference between 34,000 seeds per acre and 38,000 seeds per acre. We did several trials, multiple hybrids in each of the trials, multiple fertilizer treatments as well, and these results are averaged across all of those. And some of the yields are a little low, and that's because the yields are averaged across the zero nitrogen control treatments in those trials. But it was consistent that in all of the trials, I think we did 8 of them in the last 3 years. Uh, there's no significant difference in southern Minnesota between 34,000 and 38,000 seeds per acre. So it looks like just increasing the planting rate alone is not the key to increasing yield in all of the cases. I talked with Dr. Fred Bilo about this from University of Illinois, and he's kind of an expert in crop physiology. And he suggested that, soil moisture between mid-July through early August, around that tasseling, uh, silking, and into the blister to early milk stages, is really critical for determining, will corn respond to a higher a planting rate. So generally, kind of some of the thoughts are is that, if we have abundant and well-distributed rainfall during this time period around silking and into the blister to milk stages, then we're at a situation where the crop has higher yield potential, and also in a situation where we could have even higher yield with slightly higher planting rates. So if we're looking for situations where we may have a response to a higher planting rate than normal, we probably want to look for highly productive zones in the field, and also trying to target a year when we expect to have really good soil moisture during that period around flowering. So, for farmers, what should we do for planting rates, especially when the seed costs are high and the grain prices are low? Well, I think it's good to plant with rates you're comfortable with. And, I don't think there's a lot of evidence out there that just increasing the planting rate beyond that is going to, be the silver ticket to the higher yield. But if you want to do some testing, you can plant some strips at higher planting rates, and then maybe take some stand counts to verify that what you planted was actually, uh, what you thought you planted, and document what the planting populations are, and then take the yield monitor and see what you got out there for yield. But the other thing about corn is it is labeled to compensate a little bit. The difference between, 34,000 and 36,000 seeds per acre isn't, really that much in terms of a population difference. And the ears are able to compensate a little bit for small differences in planting rate. So if we walk out in our fields and we see very large ears filled to the tip, and if we see ears where they even have a second ear that has a little bit of harvestable grain on it, that's probably a situation where your planting rate was a little low for the growing conditions and the hybrid that was there. On the other hand, indicators that the planting rate was too high would be like when we have an excessive number of barren plants in the field, plants that don't have any harvestable grain on them, and when we have small ears that have excessive loss of kernels at the tip, say more than 1 inch, and when we have excessive stalk lodging in the fall. So those are all situations that indicate, your planting rate was probably higher than what was economically optimum. So that's kind of an overview of what everything I had to say today. I will turn it over to Seth and Matt.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, well, Seth is pulling up his slides. If you wouldn't mind taking a couple questions, Jeff, that are corn specific.
Yeah.
Um, and in our game planning for this session, I think you really set us up well because these are strategy choices producers can take this year that aren't going to really cost them another dime on their input costs, right? It's about planting date. It's about hybrid and maturity selection. Things that really are about the deployment of resources, maybe to just maximize profits this year when it's needed. Looking at some questions that have come in, you've really got a lot of engagement on early planting of corn, Jeff. There was a comment more around, could we look at the forecast and hold off on a pre-emergent herbicide? That's another factor that's going to decrease maybe if mid-April weather turns sour, right? It's going to hurt emergence. So there's a planting rate question there. So if we're thinking of early planted corn, do you recommend a higher seeding rate at that time? Or is 34,000 going to be optimum when you think of your planting rate trials?
Yeah, we did a planting rate by population study a few years ago, and other people have done them as well. And what they found was that the optimum final stand doesn't differ regardless of planting date. However, the other thing to think about practically is how many seeds are we losing that aren't emerging, and producing harvestable ears on different planting dates. And when we think about that, if we're planting super early, then obviously we probably want to, don't skimp on seeds and make sure that we have enough out there because we're probably going to have some attrition, lose a few, that type of thing. If we're planting later when it's warmer conditions, we could probably cut back a little bit on the planting rate to avoid having so much overage. Generally, about 5% overplanting is kind of the common recommended rate, but under stressful conditions, you may think about maybe bumping that up a little bit and planting later. Maybe you could back down on that a little bit.
That's fantastic. And then a clarifying question for your 34,000 versus 38,000 planting pops across those nitrogen rates. Was that, let's say 34,000, was that the emerged or the planted population?
Yeah, those are the planted rates.
Mhm. So we could assume emerge is maybe just take off 500 or 1,000 plants per
Yeah, it was
acre coming up.
pro probably 95% of what was planted. So the
Awesome.
final
Well,
stand,
Jeff, I
final stands were
appreciate
probably 32,000.
32. Okay, perfect. Jeff, if you'll hang out, we're going to turn the floor to Seth now, and we'll hang out for those slides. Thank you, Seth.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Let's see if I can get this to advance. Hey, I'm gonna talk more narrowly today. I'm gonna hit on a couple topics, and I'm actually gonna skip through some of these because I think we're generating some questions, and it'd be really nice to have just a little bit of time. Especially, I'm gonna talk a little bit about planting dates, and I know everybody loves to talk about planting corn versus soybean in the spring. So, let's hit on that. And Jeff really queued this up nicely for a planting date discussion. I think the conservative view on both crops is that we can plant corn and soybeans until pretty late and get really good yields. And so I think we're everybody's pretty hung up on the details about what they should do on April 20 or April 15 or April 10. But let's look at soybeans individually first. And this is not gonna be all encompassing. We're not gonna cover everything in soybean planting date here, but I just wanted to really hit the very highlights. And then again, hopefully this will spur some questions. I think a lot of this is very commonsensical. I think everybody pretty much understands all this, but there's a couple points that I wanted to make. I mean, and one that's very obvious, but I think it's really clear to queue up is that physiologically, the planting date in soybean isn't really that important. What's important is when that soybean crop comes up. And I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but what I was thinking about yesterday was really is what you're doing is you're with early planting, you're allowing potential future heat units to help accelerate your soybean yields out there. So you're looking at future weather and conditions in your field when we're planting early soybeans in the hopes that we can get that crop up and going and emerged early and then take off. Planting day really doesn't make a lot of difference in Minnesota because, as many of you know, you could plant on April 20 and May 5th, and everything comes up on May 10th or 15th. So, irrespective of the planting date. So, those end up being pretty nominal differences in the end. So the old Pioneer summary back, Ryan Van Runkel put a nice summary together of a lot of research from the Upper Midwest back a few years ago. This was in one of the old Growing Points at the time when Ryan was at Pioneer. And it characterized all these studies that were these were all multi-site studies over multiple years in each of these states, and basically outline this kind of response in soybean where we have this low response um, structure to the data where we don't have a lot of yield response to early planting up all the way through May 30th. And then after May 30th, we fall off the cliff and we're losing, 1% or more per day after that. Bruce Potter and Lamberton had a really, really nice study throughout almost his entire career at Lamberton, where he did a really thorough job of doing corn and soybean planting dates, and the soybean dates were planting date studies were fantastic. Every year he had a full season variety and then something shorter. And these aren't a lot shorter; they're just a little bit shorter. Most years we're talking about at Lamberton kind of like early twos versus kind of mid to late ones as a contrast. So maybe a half maturity group shorter. A couple years they were a little bit longer than that is the difference. But both are fully basically adapted for the zone, and these would be commercial varieties that farmers would grow. What we see from the data over 25 years, if we put all the data together, basically we're getting 0.2 of a point of a percentage point, 0.2 of a percentage point drop per day. So in more digestible terms, that would be 2% over 10 days. So if we're held out by 10 days over this period, that would equal 2%. So we're talking about a bushel and a half or something like that per 10-day period as we delay planting anywhere from early April all the way through the end of May. And we basically got the same exact point where that data separates and we have that sharp drop throughout June and into July. There is some indication that the very earlier planting dates had more variability, but not a lot. The other important thing that is really critical to note here is if you look at the top, right at 100% of the yield potential for any year, we could plant anywhere from early April all the way through early June. And we had individual years where those planting dates were the best planting date in terms of yield potential. So huge range over this long period of time in terms of the response. I think what's more important here, and I think this actually ties in really closely with what Jeff mentioned around productivity. If we separated out the data and just looked at highly productive environments, so this is kind of a post hoc analysis. So after the fact, we looked through and we separated out all the better years from the poorer years. And in Lamberton, this is mostly driven by August and September rainfalls. In those highly productive environments, we had a steeper curve on this. So it was 0.3 for the full maturities and 1.15 tenths of a point per day for the shorters. So we just pushed this slope up a little bit more. It means that we had a more responsive, we were more responsive to planting date when we had really good environments, and this makes a lot of sense. The other side of this is when we had low productivity environments, and these are just the other half. So we split this perfectly in half, high and low. And if we looked in a low productivity environment, there was absolutely no difference in yields across that whole range. So if you had a normal year or kind of a cruddy year in terms of your soybean performance, early planting did not help you at all in those years. So really, when we're planting early, we're really looking to take advantage of not only this potential early season heat unit accumulation, as I mentioned, but the reality is we're really looking for that later season piece. The other side of this is the shorter season varieties are going to respond less. So, from a management production standpoint, I think we urge people to plant as early as they can. But know that these more highly productive fields, your better fields are going to respond more to that. So we definitely want to cue those in and put those in early if we can. Any of those sandy fields, low productivity fields, parts of fields that are sandy and hilltops, those areas are not going to respond. And in fact, there's kind of a negative curve if we look to the porous yielding environments, and so delayed planting actually helps those. We reduce leaf area early on, and we rip through water a little bit less when we plant late. And if we've got really tough fields, those definitely need not be planted early, and they probably would benefit from planting a regular time or even later. One more, just in terms of summary, I think this kind of gets into this question about, as we move over this question that everybody likes to talk about, corn versus soybeans. I think it's important to think that um, the soybean crop, I think we should look at it an early planting, not from a yield perspective. These yields are really, really shallow. 2 tenths per day or 3 tenths per day is really small over a long period of time. So a day or two delay does not make any real significant difference on our fields. I think we want to look at it from a risk management standpoint, time management, and working day management relative to yield. So I think if we can get out of this idea of planting soybeans early as yield enhancement and think of it as a more of a collective farm returns, I think, and a systems type approach, I think that'd be better. One portion of this is that soybeans, there's an opportunity to consider that they're a little bit more resilient when they're planted earlier than corn. I think this is a debatable point. There's certain things about soybeans that make them much more resilient. Certainly, loss of stand and some other factors really lend themselves towards soybean. On the other hand, they do get taken out by frost early, entirely as well. So we can. I think you could pick that argument on both sides, but I think we have pretty good. I think there's a pretty good basis for this idea that soybean is pretty resilient when it's planted very early, even relative to corn. On the other hand, I think the more important pieces are early planted corn actually costs less to replant, and the penalty for replanting is lower in soybean than corn. And therefore, I would say that this is the low risk situation for a very early planting. And so if you think about it holistically, I think that's the perspective you could look at with very early planted soybeans. The other thing about early planted soybean that is kind of nice relative to corn, and this comes around to one of the questions that Jeff faced, was around managing for early planted corn versus regular planted corn. And I think with soybean, we have an opportunity to actually manage it different. We can crank up populations pretty high. We can add seed treatments. There's some things that we could do. We can manage seed depth a lot with soybean to basically manage emergence dates relative to soil moisture and future weather that we're looking at. So there's a real opportunity to manage around early planted soybean that we don't have good options on the corn side. I think there's also an opportunity, and this could be very debatable, but there's an opportunity to manage some of these early planted kind of marginal soils. I think we can throw some soybeans out there. This probably lends itself to the first point about risk. But I do think that there's an opportunity in some situations that farmers get really itchy to do something. There's a lot of corn gets mudded in a day too early out there. And I guess if all those farmers that were planting corn a day too early would just plant soybeans a day too early, we're only talking about a day, but I think we could potentially increase our corn yields overall and probably not affect our soybean yields at all. And then, of course, always the regular question is better in the bag or in the soil. And I come back to this point about 2%, 0.2 of a point per day. Over 20 days, that's 4% yield advantage to early planting during this period. And on 65 bushels, that's 2.5 bushels. So there is an advantage, but we're talking about over a long period of time. So I think about planting from a big picture perspective, not today versus tomorrow, but think about planting windows, working day availability. You've got a good day today. You need to plant a crop. Maybe you could throw soybean in the ground that day. Okay, I'm going to go through this very quick. I have a lot of text here. I'm going to skip over a lot of this. But I wanted to touch briefly on this question about inputs around soybeans, especially, in light of really tough economic conditions. And I think things have changed a lot in the last 3 weeks. But certainly we still have tough economic conditions. And so farmers are looking at soybeans and how to manage their soybean crop differently than we did when we had $14 soybeans for sure. And I pulled some literature, and this is what some of the literature was saying about farmer behavior. And these are the ones that I can see firsthand, is that farmers are really looking at ROI over yield. There's a shift back from this focus entirely on maximizing yields at all costs. Now we're back on this question about ROI. I think it's the right way. We probably needed to be looking at this all along. I think it's better. It's a better economic position for farmers to be thinking about, even in good years. But I think what farmers are doing, certainly some of the first cuts of this, is they're making generic swaps. They're making fewer field passes where they can, and trying to bank on precision savings from VRT and row shutoffs and things like that. I bring this up this morning about on-farm research is to acknowledge that I've been very bold and maybe arrogant about this approach to sourcing of information for farmers. Farmers need better and better resources to evaluate products and systems that they put out on their farms. I was really one that just suggested that farmers really needed to listen to university. They should shut off their advertising and not talk to the salesmen about things and just talk to their university people for years. The reality is we need to get all the information we can. Farmers need to have the best information they can. And I do think that with new technologies that we've got on the farm, we have much better capacity to do good research on the farm. And this extra management time, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, I hope, is that I think the extra management time it takes in this economic climate around on-farm testing is probably well worth it. I think when we had $14 soybeans, we had an opportunity for us just to take a salesman word that this product was going to increase soybean yields by 2 bushels and put it out there. And not test it before and then not test the performance afterwards. But I think we're beyond that, and we need to think more clearly about how we're making those choices. The bottom 2 lines here are the important ones. I see this on-farm research as a way to de-risk adoption of new technologies on the farm, and that's whether that's a product or whether that's some larger system that the farmer's doing. De-risking that by deploying it on a few acres and testing it initially and then putting out on broader acres if it works. So it offers an opportunity for product testing, but then also quality control and continuous improvement. One challenge we have with farmers is that farmers make so many decisions every day they can't second guess themselves. It just drives folks crazy to have to second guess all of our and all of their decisions. But I think, again, if we're in a tough economic environment, we have to be thinking more clearly. We've got to make good choices, and then we got to verify that those were actually the right choices and not just run them into the ground until the next product comes along to replace it. Okay, last couple things. These are kind of larger themes that I've picked up over the past 25 years of doing research here, is that I've really come down to classifying all these products for soybeans as basically pesticidal type ingredients for farmers, for products that protect soybean yield. And then everything else is lumped into this group that I would call yield enhancers or yield promoters. And basically, I know there's a bunch of industry folks that are going to want to shoot me over this, but the reality is, I haven't found any of these yield enhancers, yield promoters, magic products that have done anything for us. And there's been some marginal things, some things that look like they could be hopeful. There's some things that maybe fall between the classes. I think about rhizobial inoculants and things like this. I suppose you could consider that a yield enhancer. And yes, I would consider that probably a pretty good investment for most farmers still. But I would basically argue that I have not come across a product that's marketed as a yield enhancer that's done anything for us. So if we look at pesticides, now that's the other side of this, is pesticides have a huge opportunity for a huge ROI. These things are powerful products, and when they work really well. Prophylactic applications actually work pretty well in a lot of situations. That's how a lot of these things go out, and they end up being relatively positive. You know, it's not a very good IPM principle, but these things do tend to work okay, and they tend to be positive. But the reality is, if we can use them properly on the proper pests at the right time, they really do work for us. So again, I think farmers really need to continue to do more research, put more time and effort into deploying products that work correctly, and then managing those products better. I think in these tight environmental or economic times, I think it's the time that we need to really spend more time on management around these things. And be skeptical. This is the time to be skeptical. Be skeptical of extension, your neighbors, university, and be skeptical of yourself as a farmer. Discard all these beliefs that things were really working and that these things actually did, and prove it to yourself. Evaluate products and then validate that they're working for you. So with that, I will quit. And Matt, I hope we have some time for some questions.
You sure do, because you got a lot of engagement as well, Seth. And I'm just gonna give my couple cents if you allow me a little rope and let you think about this in your response. So the questions you got centered more around this planting depth question to kind of tease out emergence, and timing of emergence and moisture. And then you also got a question on, hey, can we save costs by eliminating seed treatment on soybeans? And I think that all relates. Now, from my maybe farmer cap perspective, you can plant shallower in April, even if you don't find moisture right away, because I think you're going to get rains at some point. We have a bigger problem if there's no rain to get imbibition. If you plant deeper, you'll definitely get moisture, but you're finding colder soil as well. Maybe you're taking a lot longer to emerge. By the time you emerge, we're getting really hot weather and we're pulling the cotyledonary heads off the soybean, and we're losing a lot of stand that way. And honestly, would you have been better off just waiting? Because, like you said, emergence dictates actual yield potential, not planting date of emergence. So I've seen it both ways. I've heard it a lot this spring, folks talking about planting depth, more leaning towards plant shallower if you're planting earlier to get soybeans out of the ground in April. And we couldn't have this conversation with corn, right? Because as Jeff explained, with the secondary root system, you can cheat yourself out of depth if you plant too shallow on corn. But if this goes back to soybeans, if you used a drill in the olden days and just got a little soil over the top, you'd be fine because soybean are a tap-rooted crop. So we have this option to take with these levers. So I guess, Seth, your thoughts on all that?
Well, you mentioned a rope. I think this is a perfect, symbol for this whole question is, yeah, I gave myself the rope here to be hung by, because it's a huge, I think there's an opportunity here, but I don't think within a couple minutes we can have the full discussion. There's so many nuances to this, but definitely, and everybody online understands this question about the fact that we need moisture and we need heat for that soybean to emerge. But we do, as you mentioned, we have the opportunity to manage that around. So if we just isolated the frost question, first of all, if we think about farmers planting very early, but they're concerned about, the 10-day forecast does show, a dip in temperatures at 7 days out or something like that to low temperatures. I think that'd be too narrow for us real early. But if farmers are concerned about that, then they can keep these things down just a little bit more. We can manage emergence days by kind of managing the depth in the soil, as you mentioned. And then we have to work around the moisture. Yes, in moisture, but the moisture is going to come. Those are questions. I think that just add risk to the situation. And I guess I don't want to go any deeper than that because there's too many nuances, I think, to discuss right here, but I do think it is an opportunity. I'm certainly not going to promote plant deep early, plant shallow late, or plant shallow early. Those I think are too broad for the discussion, especially based on the different kinds of years, different soil types that we've got out there. So I think farmers understand these things pretty well. As you mentioned, the soybean really just needs to get covered up. And to get decent emergence out of it. So a lot of what we're doing with planting depth is managing emergence timing and uniformity with it. So I'm not going to go any further than that unless somebody really
Sure.
wants to poke me on it harder.
I think I'd advise, folks can follow up with you for a private conversation, and then you
For
can drill
sure.
down into specific farm by farm needs as well. Um, that being said, I think this idea of this rise of early infecting soybean diseases. We're having more sudden death moving into Minnesota. We just identified Dean Melvick's lab red crown rot for the first time in Rock County, Minnesota. These are diseases that will infect early and hang out and cause early plant death at the end of the year. Luckily, we have seed treatments like Sultro, Levo, this new Victrado coming out that are all labeled for those particular diseases. But I think folks are thinking more about like Pythium phytophthora, um, Rhizoctonia, Fusarium. What I've seen, right, is the quicker the plant gets out of the ground, there's research that would support you have a maybe diminished return to some of those other seed treatments, the killers and the nibblers, right, that we have of early soybean seedling disease. So maybe we don't want to unpack that anymore, but
Well,
there's definitely some
I
things
want
to
to give
be.
the counterpoint is that Bruce has good data to support this idea that when we plant really, really early, we're kind of outliving the actives in some of these products, or at least the indication that that is probably happening. When we plant very early, we're not getting huge benefit from some of the seed treatments in some of our data that we've looked at. So I think I think that there's a real sweet spot with seed treatments. I know that if we plant, we get an inch. We have good warm conditions. We get an inch of rain. We seem to get really good response from seed treatments, meaning the treatment function physically moves into the rooting zone. I think we wash it partially off the seed. We don't have all the seed treatment end up on the soil top as these nice colored flakes out there. But I do think planting very late, we don't really need it because things pop out of the ground. I guess I would say overall that if you're on the fence about seed treatments, that yes, early planting is probably a better place for seed treatments. It would definitely steer me towards cranking up the dial towards more interest in planting in using a seed treatment. But I think it goes on to this whole thing about what's the farmer's risk level in terms of planting and replanting and cost of that crop. I think this notion of very early planting in soybean should be associated with farmers that are willing to take a little bit of risk in terms of having to replant and also having the economic wherewithal to manage the additional costs.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, I think you laid that out really well too, Seth, in the slideshow. Jeff, we're going to ease you back in with a question that came prior to the meeting today. And that's a pretty direct one. How far north can we be planting or should we be planting relative maturity 105-day hybrid corn?
Yeah, generally about Redwood Falls is kind of the cutoff for that.
Okay. So if you're kind of where I'm home base, Sibley County, you're up towards Hutchinson and McLeod, you'd think that would be a little bit too far north for grain corn, around
Yeah, I think
105.
Hutchinson's getting a little far north. Down in where you're at, a little farther south, it should still be okay.
And if we're doing silage corn, we could extend that maybe just a touch longer.
Yeah, for silage corn, it's like 5 to 10 relative maturity units longer than for grain corn wherever you're at. So it gives you more flexibility there. Bigger plants, higher
Excellent.
yield.
Excellent. We could debate, I think, again, corn and soybean, which one are we planting first? From what I've heard from both you gentlemen, it's going to come down to individual farms making that decision. I would also say, I mean, I like how we touched on a bit around the actual planter pass and making sure we're setting up that seed for maximum potential. There might be some bushels just there on adapting to each field's conditions, making sure we're actually pressing gauge wheels the right amount and not, I heard you say, Jeff, smearing sidewalls and those sorts of things. And the magic of that is none of us on this call can help the folks that are listening here with that. It's going to be the planter operator getting out and checking when they're starting every field or after rain breaks. I think this last spring, I'll just throw out there was the perfect scenario where we had early planting was pretty fit. Then we had cold and heavy rain. And then we had 100 to 105-degree, really hot conditions to kind of lead us into May. So we had all these variability and very fluffy soil. And so almost every week by week or day by day, you needed to be changing that seeding depth, pressure on the gauge wheel, your closing, how aggressive you were with that. All of that is something that there are some I think there are some bushels to be said for maintenance as well and adaptation.
I'm not sure that Jeff or I mentioned this, the old thing that he and I talk and mention in every presentation is that manage planting date by soil conditions and focus on soil conditions over the date. And I think that still applies. I don't, we, Jeff and I both talked about a lot of stuff, but we probably missed the one highlight, and maybe it's because we talk about it all the time.
Sure. Um, how about this idea, this mindset this year? Can we shift from a bushels per acre, kind of just maximizing yield, to a profit per acre shift? Do you guys have any more feedback on that? I will say, as you're thinking through this, we're going to put some links to some nutrient management articles that were put out this summer in video or winter in videos. You know, the ENOR rate for corn and nitrogen has changed this winter from Minnesota Extension. There's definitely some thoughts that are had on potassium and phosphorus fertility. These sorts of things are certainly current as well and being discussed. So we're thinking about just dialing in our input costs and really the application of nutrients. If we want to think one more anecdote about planters, if we're going to put a liquid product on with the planter, are we actually putting the same amount on every row? I mean, you can use water. It's going to be cheaper than your fertilizer cost. Do a 30-second catch test and make sure that you're actually, no orifices are plugged, your pumps are working appropriately. Are you spreading your product evenly across the field? Kind of when Jeff, you mentioned, are your shutoffs working appropriately? When you merge into your headland, are you underlapping or overlapping? Are you hitting that right on? Just these little things I think are going to add up this year and give farmers more feeling of that control because we're all happier when we focus on things we can control, aren't we?
Yeah, and I think from a corn standpoint, the simplest thing you can do if you want to reduce your costs with having little impact on your yield is probably looking towards adopting university extension fertilizer guidelines. The rates are going to be probably lower than you would get from a co-op agronomist, but your yield is going to be about the same. And that those recommendations are based on a lot of trials on farm fields and on research stations over several years replicated. So I think that's kind of an easy low-hanging fruit to start with if you want to try to reduce costs.
I would say, I'm the one that always brings up these larger philosophical points, but I would say that, stereotypically or in a very large sense, farmers have really moved towards maximizing farm size based on the scale that they can manage. And so farmers have basically built their operation so they're fully engaged. They're working all the time. There isn't a lot of extra room. But I would say we've now moved into an environment where we have to, if if we want to make ends meet, any extra management time needs to be doled out towards things that can really provide return on investment. I like talking about inputs, but Matt brings up the point, and I mentioned some things earlier about management related costs that are time management. Maybe it didn't matter too much when if we didn't have even distribution of those products row by row when we were over applying products, but now that we've dialed those fertilizers back, now calibrating that planter and that in-row fertilizer is that much more important, both in terms of the yield response, but also towards the overall economics of the operation. Managing these inputs that you've paid for, now it's more important than ever to scout, and maybe there's an opportunity to pull back on something that a product you may have ordered or purchased and not put that thing out that we would have just pulled the trigger on before. So I think focusing any extra time around management is really is one way that farmers are going to be able to kind of connect the dots in terms of keeping above water this year.
I appreciate that. And a lot of that goes back to just thinking like a researcher in terms of decreasing sources of error, And so if you want to do on-farm research, Seth, you had a good points about that. You have to think about field traffic. You have to think about other ways that you're changing yield in your field. That certainly is a key point. Bruce Potter was listening, Seth, when you talked about seed treatments and timing. He wanted to share that wet conditions shortly after planting are the big driver for effectiveness of seed treatments for disease in soybean. So that was good that he answered in there too. So any final thoughts, gentlemen, here as we go into the season? Maybe your last key takeaway for us?
I'm out.
I think I
Yeah, we
covered.
used the
Yep.
hour quite well. Thanks, Jeff. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm good.
Yes, you guys are available to the public, of course, and you both have a lot of speaking parts here at Field School. I'm going to plug that here as a member of IAP. That's going to be July 29th and 30th this year. So come see some of these questions in real time and some of the field plots we're developing for you folks right now. It's going to be a great program. So with that, thank you both. Just bringing us to a close here.